Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Charles Shapiro, the President of World Affairs Council. Today's program is with Dr. Raphael Bostic, CEO and President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. I want to welcome, we've got 4 of our board members who are on the program today in the audience. Paige Alexander, CEO of the Carter Center, Dr. Mark Becker, President of Georgia State University, Ambassador Gordon Giffen, partner at Denton's LLP, and Dr. Jagdish Shath from the Goizueta Business School at Emory University. Supporting organizations for today's program are, of course, the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, the World Affairs Councils of America, our umbrella organization, and Patty Tucker and Go Beyond Profit, a statewide alliance of CEOs committed to business as a force for good. In about a half an hour, we'll take questions from the audience. Please do not use the chat function, but use the question and answer function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It says more. If you click on more, one of the things that drops down is Q&A. And so please use that. Please keep your questions short. That will help me. And end them in a question mark, so they're a real question. The moderator of today's program is Dennis Lockhart. Dennis is the former president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, 2007 to 2017. He's a distinguished professor of practice at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech, who is a founding board member of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta, and in fact was our first board chair. So over to you, Dennis.
Thank you so much, Charles. Let me begin by introducing our distinguished speaker today. Raphael, good to be with you again. I'm looking forward to this conversation. We've done this before. I think most of the audience is familiar with Raphael Bostic's background, but I'll just very quickly go through it. He is the 15th president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and that, of course, makes him a participant and member of the Federal Open Market Committee. So he is in the middle of monetary policy. Prior to joining the Fed, he was a professor at the University of Southern California. I'll point out that USC is still in the running in the NCAA basketball tournament. So good work, Trojans. He started his career at the Fed and worked for a while in Treasury, then joined University of Southern California, went back to a housing position as a policymaker in the Obama administration, and then returned to University of Southern California. He is a native of New Jersey, undergraduate education at Harvard, PhD from Stanford University. So with that introduction, Raphael, let me just sort of tee this up. We still are in a state of anxiety about the economy. You have been relatively optimistic in your recent and earlier comments in the year. What's your forecast? Are you still upbeat about economic prospects?
Well, first of all, good afternoon, Dennis, and good to see you. And I want to thank Charles and the World Affairs Council of Atlanta for allowing me to talk today. It's really good to be here. And thank you for the shout out with the Trojans. I will be rooting them on later on today, see if we can get to the Final Four. But to your question about my forecast and my outlook, I'm actually fairly optimistic. You know, we had the conversation in January, and at that point, there was a lot of uncertainty about what relief was going to look like for the economy. There was a package that had been done. It was through March, and there were real questions in my mind as to whether whether that was going to be long enough, whether we would be able to get through the pandemic crisis by the end of March. With the passage of the second, or this latest relief package, now we've extended the relief to going well into the summertime. And that coupled with the increased pace at which we're getting vaccines into people's arms, really, for me, has really suggested that we're starting to get to the other side of this. And there are real signs and possibilities that come the summertime, come sort of May, June, July, we will start to see consumers engaged in the economy much more freely and much more broadly. And that plus the relief out there will mean that people do have funds to engage. And so I think we can potentially see pretty significant growth going through the summer as people re-engage. And I think there are really two reasons for this. One, I mentioned the basic relief and its success. I have to commend the fiscal policy in particular for stepping up and making sure that there are funds available to get as many businesses and families in a position not so far from where they were pre-pandemic. That's critical. But I also think there's a psychological component. You know, I've been sitting in this house and pretty much this chair for the better part of a year. And I know for me, I'm looking forward to being able to be outside and talking to people and seeing them in person. My expectation is that that's going to be a more general experience, and people are going to want to go out. And we're starting to see signs of this. I've talked to a number of businesses where they're saying, particularly in the hospitality and leisure side, they're starting to see bookings that are approaching where they were pre-COVID, and in some instances even exceeding that for the spring and late spring and early summer. And I think that's a really positive sign.
Let's go a little deeper on your forecast or your outlook, and maybe talk in terms of the dual mandate objectives of the Federal Reserve: employment and inflation. So what's your view of employment? I'll point out that on one of the morning news programs, Steve Leisman of CNBC talked in terms of 1 million jobs month in the jobs report that's coming this Friday. So maybe we're looking at a real turn in the unemployment situation. What's your view?
Well, I'm hopeful that we start to see months like that. You know, in thinking about employment, I think it's useful to place this in context. Right when the pandemic hit, we lost millions and millions of jobs. And we've come a long way since then, such that unemployment is down from being in the mid double digits, mid-teens, down to somewhere in the 6 to 6.5 range. But that still leaves more than 9 million jobs that we don't have today that we had in the days before the pandemic. So there is a long way to go there. And that means that there is some excess capacity that businesses have. My hope is that the demand that I talked about in my previous comments today will spur employers to see that they've got to staff up and get moving so that they can fulfill and satisfy that demand with supply. And I'm hopeful that we see large job numbers for the next several months. But when you're down 9+ million, you know, even at 1 million jobs a month, which would be, you know, an incredible number, you know, we're still looking at least into 2022 before we get to pre-pandemic levels. And so we've still got a ways to go on the employment front before I think we'll be in a position to really be able to exhale and sort of let the marketplace play out as it will.
One of the realities of the employment hit we took last year is that it disproportionately hit minorities, minority groups, low-income groups, and women. And participation has been a particular problem in the employment picture, the decline in participation. Do you expect, let's say, in the coming months into early 2022, that we'll make up ground for those groups that have been hit so hard by this?
Well, Dennis, I'll say I certainly hope so. You know, the pandemic and the COVID crisis, one of its defining characteristics has been how it's hit the economy in an uneven way. So it's that certain groups and certain job categories and certain sectors have been disproportionately impacted. And my hope is that we will get to a place where those impacts start to fall back and we see a re-engagement in the economy. You mentioned women as one example. So there are really two dynamics there. So one dynamic is that women are disproportionately present in low-wage jobs. And we know that through this pandemic, low-wage jobs whether they be in the hospitality and leisure or in other sectors, have been the ones that have been most likely to be lost. And the employment has declined 4 times as much in the low wage portion of the worker distribution and in the highest wage sector of the distribution. But then the other part, which is also true, is that when you see schools closing because of the pandemic, when the notion of a home health aide, someone from outside coming into your home to provide services for senior citizens who are the most vulnerable, those become less viable, and someone's got to step in and take care of those people. In many families, it's been women to do that. So if we can get to a place past the pandemic where the schools are open and working again, so we don't have to think about childcare, and we can have our home health aides and others come back into the home and provide those services, that will free them up to do other things. And I'm hopeful that there will be jobs that are available for them that they can step into, so we can get that labor force participation up.
Raphael, how are you thinking about inflation, the other mandated objective? Inflation, of course, the Fed would like to get higher. It's not absolutely clear what the threshold is between undesired and desired inflation. Inflation expectations seem to be a central focus of the committee. Give us your views on the inflation mandated objective and what your expectations are.
Well, when it comes to inflation, I think the first thing to just be mindful of is that it's going to be hard to get a real clear signal over the next several months. When inflation is usually measured year over year, a year ago, we were just entering the pandemic, things were shutting down, the pressure on price changes was going way down. So just by math, I think we're going to see inflation readings over the next several months that are going to come in pretty high. But I don't think that's going to give us a full signal of things. Similarly, we saw that strong rebound toward the end of the summer. That means that is likely to mean that inflation, the pressures of measure are going to be downward facing. And then on top of all of that, we have to ask questions about how much of whatever increased demand we see in the summertime is long run sustainable. And all of those bring into question whether we're going to get clear and clean signals about what inflation looks like. What I'll say is I'm not expecting inflation to be in a runaway phase at all in the next 8 to 12 months. I think that it will start to be elevated. I think that as businesses come back and as demand increases, we're going to see some support for that. But we've been below our 2% target for a long time. And so I think it'll be a ways before we'll be in a position to think that we have fully satisfied that part of our mandate moving forward.
Okay, then to summarize, do you see growth picking up, particularly in this year, and it could be very strong growth, employment situation improving, and as you just said, inflation hard to read. So the achievement of the objective may not be clear for quite some time. Against that picture, what's your policy outlook? What do you think appropriate monetary policy is and will be for the coming months, even into next year?
Well, at a very baseline level, I don't think we're fully through the pandemic crisis. There's still uncertainty. We don't have the vaccine in enough of the population to where there is not the risk of more spikes in terms of infections and deaths. So I think we still have to be very vigilant at this point and not let our guard down to think that we are through all of this. So I think our current policy is very much appropriate. We want to provide maximum support for the economy to make sure we get through this portion of this crisis and get to the other side. Once we get to the other side, I think it's important to just be mindful of the framework that we articulated for policy at the end of last summer, where we basically said that we will be willing to let the economy run a little hotter than we might have otherwise, because we've not seen inflation become a problem as unemployment has fallen to very, very low levels. And we're going to let that play out. So going to want us to make significant progress in both of our dimensions, both in terms of inflation and in terms of our employment numbers. And so I think we're going to be where we are for a while because we have a long way to go. And I mean, all that to say, we do a lot of surveys. We talk to a lot of business leaders. If we see signs in our bank that there's something that's substantially different going on, we'll take that on board. But right now, I'm not expecting that. And so I'm comfortable just keeping us where we are.
So you're describing a very patient posture on the part of the Fed, even if in some cases the financial markets seem to be a little impatient, either about the growth picture precipitating liftoff and tapering, or conceivably the employment picture improving so dramatically, or inflation risk. So let's talk a bit about the framework. Let's step back, and I'd like your interpretation of the changes that were made when it was basically presented last September. My reading, for what it's worth, is that this is a pretty profound change. Average inflation targeting and a definition of maximum employment that is inclusive and broad-based, taking into consideration a lot more than perhaps we did in my day. That's my sense of it. Tell us how you would characterize the strategic framework that was presented last year.
So I actually, this is one of the hazards of having my predecessor as an interviewer, because you read the tea leaves extremely well. I think both of those are important major changes: the more inclusive treatment of employment and consideration of employment, and then this idea that we need to see sort of a balance in our inflation experience, so that our 2% target is actually an average and not perceived to be either a ceiling or a floor, depending on where we are. I think those are two big things. The other thing I would also add on this is that we've really taken on board the experience over the last, 10 years, where inflation has just not been at the forefront of our problems. And so given that we've been able to run the economy very, very hot, hotter than some expected when unemployment was in the mid 3% area, we didn't see inflation spike, which suggests that we weren't close or on the cusp of losing control of the economy and having it overheat. I think we've taken that on board, and I'll say from my perspective, we're going to not be too overly prescriptive. I'm not going to be too overly prescriptive as we see the unemployment rate drop to levels that are by historic standards might be extremely low. I'm going to wait to see that be corresponded with signals that inflation is really starting to move on a trajectory moving forward. So you can think about this as lower for longer relative to where we've been in the past. And I think that is another pretty significant shift in terms of how we're thinking about our policies.
How are you thinking about how long and how high? So that kind of question. What I mean by that is when does desirable inflation become undesirable and therefore precipitate a reaction on the part of you and your colleagues? And given the state of inflation for the last several years and the current run rate of inflation, how long do you think it's going to take to get to a satisfactory place?
You're asking the $10,000 questions on all of these. I think that to know exactly how long is going to really require a deep appreciation for the context. I will tell you, since I've been in this job, we've had inflation ranging anywhere from 1.5, 1.6 up to 1.9. If you just do a mirror of that, that would suggest like 2.1 to 2.4 ranges are not necessarily going to create a lot of angst on my part. For me, I always say that the level above 2% is not the big story for me. It's the trajectory once you get above 2%. And so if we're at 2.4, but it's a stable 2.4 that's going to continue and looks like it's going to continue for a while, I can be very, very comfortable with that. If it's a 2.2 that moves to 2.3, that moves to 2.5, that moves to 2.8, now we're in a trajectory space which might lead me to be a bit more concerned. So I think about it like that. One of the things, and you mentioned this earlier, thinking about inflation expectations and focusing on that. If we are effective in having people take on board our policy approach and inflation expectations stay pretty anchored close to our 2% level, that will also give me some comfort. And so we're going to pay close attention to how consumers and how businesses and how financial market participants are thinking about inflation, just to make sure that we haven't become disconnected in our thinking with how they are thinking about how the economy will play out.
The audience, I think, has a pretty clear view, Raphael, of your base case outlook, which is on balance a rather optimistic one, although with a policy setting that is defined by patient. Let's talk about risks. What are some of the risks, upside or downside, around your base case that you're watching? And just to kind of give you a preview, we'll also talk a little bit about financial instability risk. So let's start with a general risk question.
So, first and foremost, the first is the virus and how the virus progresses relative to how the vaccine progresses. At some level, it's almost like a race to try to get the maximum number of people vaccinated but before the virus has a chance to mutate into something that we can't handle. I think we're doing very well on this, but that is still a risk and something that we will have to be mindful of. A second is really around labor force participation, as you mentioned, and whether we evolve to sort of a new steady state that has fewer people engaged in the labor force. And that, actually, I should say this even more broadly. Sort of one of the risks and the questions we have to be wrestling with is to what extent has our experience over the last 12 or 13 months changed how we're going to do business? To what extent has it changed the types of goods that we want to purchase, the types of activities we want to engage in, the types of work that is done, where work is done? Like, all of these are pretty fundamental structural changes that could have pretty significant implications for demand for labor, demand for skills, and what investments are going to look like in the future. And so there's potentially a fair amount of disruption that we can see, but this is something we're going to have to monitor very much in the real time. Those are downside risks. I actually think that there are upside risks as well. The great response that I'm anticipating could be even greater. Right? We know that there are many families that have taken some of the relief money, used it to deleverage themselves, so they're in a stronger financial position. And there is a school of thought that says we could see a burst of activity and performance coming into the summer, which could lead us to see even more robust recovery. So Steve Leisman's 1 million jobs a month could become sort of the standard through the summer. That would be an upside risk that would force me to have to rethink the timing of when we get back to pre-COVID levels, and then potentially where our policy should be.
One of the words that you hear frequently today is the risk of overheating. And your colleague, Charlie Evans of the Chicago Fed recently, I thought it was a great contribution to the debate, asked the question, what is overheating exactly? What are we talking about when we use that term? Is there an overheating risk? Maybe because of a $2 trillion relief package, plus the Fed's extremely accommodative position? Do you think if there is such a thing as overheating, it could occur?
So I actually do think there's such a thing as overheating. And the way I think about this is if conditions get so tight and businesses have to get so aggressive, that they start either paying unsustainable wages to people or bidding on deals and paying unsustainable or kind of high risk valuations for assets. Those things can come crashing down and they can have ancillary impacts. So I actually think there is potential for that. I just don't see any of that happening right now. I think we're so far away from any kind of extreme upward pressure on wages in the labor market. We're down so many jobs. And when I talk to financial market folks, the bankers and others, they all tell me that the risk that they're seeing in credit markets is extremely low. That repayment is happening at a far better clip than they expected in the early months of the pandemic. And they're not seeing signs that that's going to change in the months to come. So I think those signs observationally tell me that we're not really in range where overheating is something we have to worry about too much.
And are you concerned at all with some of the buoyant financial markets and the risk of a systemic event of some kind, a la 2008? Does that worry you at all?
Well, that always worries me. And I have to say, and you know this as well, as part of our job is to be worried. So we do worry about those things. I do have to say, though, I'm not seeing the pressures on the broader financial system right now to suggest that we are nearing anything that would suggest that financial instability is going to be a major factor in the next couple of months. But again, this is something that we have to continue to monitor. Financial markets can move extremely fast. And so we have to be ever diligent. And I've got a bunch of really talented people in the building, some of them you hired actually, who are doing very close watching of these markets. And they're pretty good about getting my attention when they get nervous.
What then is your interpretation of the rising term rates, 10-year Treasury rate and longer maturity rates? How do you process that? What's your thinking?
So I think there are lots of possible approaches. Two that I'm centered on more. First is optimism about the trajectory of the economy more broadly. We have the large of relief. Their households and businesses, many of them now have cash that they want to spend, and so the prospects have just improved tremendously. And when that happens, we expect the longer term yields to go up. So I think that there's a basic piece there. And then the second is, and this is more speculative, I will just admit, I think people are starting to hear our articulation of our policy and taking on board that we are actually pretty serious about trying to get inflation to a place where 2% is the average. And that reality will also put upward pressure on the long side of the yield curve and lead to the steepening. Right now, I would just say, my biggest concerns in that space would be if there was evidence that these trends were triggering breakdowns in market functioning, such that certain funding was not happening at necessary levels. And that has not happened to date. And I'm grateful for that. And I'm hopeful and I expect that will continue for the months to come.
Can you see a set of conditions in which you would support intervention on the part of the Fed to try to suppress those longer term rates? Another Operation Twist, or changing the composition of bond purchases to try to put pressure on the 10-year or longer? Can you see that happening?
Well, I mean, I always approach this with, don't take any tools off the table preemptively. So certainly I leave that open as a possibility. But right now, I'm pretty comfortable with how financial markets stand today, and I'm not really anticipating that we'll need to do very much to manage that market. As long as the markets are functioning and the long rates, so for mortgages and other things, are still at pretty low levels from a historical perspective. Bond spreads are not outside of the range of what we've seen normally. Markets are functioning, and that gives me some comfort.
One of the themes of your career, Raphael, has been housing, and particularly affordable housing. And I know you've taken the Atlanta Bank and moved some of the research into the question of disparities and housing disparities particularly. Can you talk about the work that your bank is doing and what your views are on the question of affordable housing?
Sure. So, one of the things that I've found to be very, very interesting in this role is that I go around and I get to talk to a lot of people, as you know, and you just hear a number of the challenges and the barriers that communities are facing in helping their residents achieve their full potential. And so, things like broadband in rural areas. We do a lot on job training and reskilling people so that they're competitive for new jobs. And housing is another one of those areas or issues where we've seen a lot of challenge. If people don't have stable housing, they're not going to be doing long run investment in themselves. They're going to be thinking much more short term, where am I going to lay my head tomorrow? And that puts constraints on how much they're going to be able to contribute to the economy, and in turn, how resilient and how dynamic our broader and macro economies will be. So, we think about this a lot, and we're really trying to understand that. The things that I find interesting in affordable housing today is that we really need to be thoughtful about, are we building enough housing? So the supply, is it matching the demand? Because in many markets, that's not the case, and that's bidding it up. And then the second is the location of the housing, such that people at all income levels have true access to neighborhoods in all locations. And so that, because if we have a situation where those with the lowest incomes have to travel the furthest, that's a lot of burden, and that will put burden on those families, but also on the functioning of our economy and basically our day-to-day living. So I think we need to be collectively pretty thoughtful about both of those things. And, I've got people on staff who are working on both of those dimensions. And then one last thing I'll say, because it's actually relevant in the pandemic space. We have so far skirted the notion of an eviction crisis and a foreclosure crisis. I think that has been a very good thing. But for those families that are in arrears and have taken advantage of the forbearance and the moratoria, we've got to think about what a policy will look like to make landlords whole, so they're not exclusively bearing the burden of these things. And I think that will very soon become a conversation that is taken on the local level and at the state level and at the federal level to make sure that we collectively bear the burdens of relief in a period where something so extraordinary has happened.
Let me end with the question on central bank independence. And to tee this up, some of the policy reactions of the last year have been, as they always are, controversial when there's a crisis. In addition, some of the senior Fed officials were strong advocates of the fiscal package that was recently passed, which of course is highly politicized. You just talked about work that your bank is doing in looking into housing disparities. You could even argue that the new definition, so to speak, of the employment objective under the dual mandate is sort of moving in the direction of taking on social issues. So the accusation has been made, the Fed is in a period of mission creep, and the independence of the Fed could be in jeopardy. What's your thinking on that question?
So, I think about our role is really twofold. So one is to, let me step back and say, our role is to have shared stewardship of the U.S. economy. And to do that, we have our mission and our mandate, which is to manage price stability and full employment. But it's also, I think, to talk about and put a spotlight on those areas that are holding us back and that are keeping us from fully realizing the full potential of this economy, which then feeds back to our mission, right? So maximum employment is an important element to this. So when we see those things, and when I see those things, I think it's incumbent on us to talk about them and to put down markers so that policymakers across the spectrum are aware of those things that are challenges. I think talking about them is appropriate and necessary because if we don't, we could get stung by them. And I think about, I talked about broadband, for example. When I go to rural places and they're thinking about doing economic development, they note that we struggle to attract businesses. We struggle to be a resilient economy because I can't get broadband to be located here. That's an economic issue, and that's a fundamental one. And if we're going to have measures of our success in terms of policy, I think we should be thinking about how do we unleash the potential that's been untapped. So I actually don't think that we are compromising ourselves in this way. I think we are actually leaning in pretty heavily to the idea that we really want this economy to be as big as possible. And I'll speak for myself. I want this economy to be as big as possible. And I want it to engage and include as many people as possible. And so all the conversations that I have are in that space. Now, there are some other things as well, and in terms of viability, because there are emerging risks. Since I've been in this role, we've had more Category 4 and Category 5 hurricanes hit the Gulf Coast than I can recall in my entire lifetime. That has implications for what prudent risk management should look like. And I think we should be in that conversation, as a bank regulator and other things. So I actually don't think we've strayed too far. We have been more vocal in the COVID crisis around fiscal policy, for example, because of the nature of the pandemic and that it was this unprecedented emergency. But all of it is with the eye of really fully realizing complete efficacy of our policy and the robustness and resilience of the U.S. economy.
Great answers to all my questions. Now let me bring Charles Shapiro back in, and Charles will present some of the questions from the audience. Charles?
Yeah, we've got a load of questions. I'm going to shorten them and look for short answers if it is possible.
All right, I'll keep them short.
But you've been great so far with short answers. I am impressed. You and Dennis set a record for how many questions and answers you've gone through. This is from Edward Chartar. What would be the impact of a $15 minimum wage on employment, economic growth, and public sector debt?
Well, this is a super complicated question. I would say there are at least three dimensions. So one, the cost basis for businesses will go up on the labor side, and basic economics would suggest that means we're going to have fewer jobs in that space. The second is that the families that do get that wage are actually potentially going to have more income, which should leave them more stable and more secure. And those families should be more contributing or less of a drag, depending on how you want to look at it, on social services and other things, and that can collectively leave us better off. And then the third is really around, and I think this is an issue that we also have to think about. To what extent does this issue generate a community conversation that allows the community to think about itself and what it's trying to accomplish and where it's trying to go? All of these situations have two sides. There are arguments, the costs and benefits in both, and each local community's got to figure out how they weigh those and what it implies about where they're trying to get to.
Sandy Gruskin asks, what's the risk relative deficit? A number of members of Congress are now focusing on the size of the deficit.
So I actually think about this in a more sequential way, and it is, look, we're in a pandemic right now. We've got to get through this as whole as possible. And the reason is, if you on the other side, once we're done, the more businesses and the more families that are not in deep distress, the more they'll be able to contribute to our growth and get us to have a more robust recovery. So today, I think my focus and emphasis has really been on, let's get us through the crisis. And I don't think we're there yet. Once we get to the other side, then we can think about, what will be required to manage that debt. But I'm hopeful that if we do the crisis management today well, there'll be more businesses and more families that are there, ready to robustly help us manage that debt into the future. But I think this is an issue, but I just think right now we still have some immediate term things to consider.
We've got a couple of questions, one from Gail Evans and one from Bill Clifford, who I have to give a nod to as the president of the World Affairs Councils of America, about cryptocurrencies. How does the Fed look at cryptocurrencies? I mean, this is so far beyond your traditional role. How do you deal with that?
Well, it's interesting. So we are in the payment space, and the Federal Reserve has been in this space for a long time. We have cash, if you still use cash, is a Federal Reserve note. And we are involved in clearing and settlements and wire transfers and all those sorts of things. So this is a space that we are familiar with. The interesting thing with cryptocurrency is it brings together a number of different factors that we just really have to think about. One is what are the implications for an economy, for monetary policy, if we have a payment system that is heavily in the crypto space? Does that change our ability to transmit policy in an effective way? A second, which is related to this, is the notion of central bank digital currencies. And if we were to do that, there's one scenario where we would actually have to have an account at the central bank for every American, so we could get them that currency. That has implications for how we track, what do we track, what happens with privacy, all those sorts of issues. So there's a lot, and there are a lot of streams in the Federal Reserve that are working on these issues. What I say today is that the crypto space has not gotten to a scale where it's really systemic in its implications, but it's growing and it's getting increasing attention, and it's something we'll definitely have to keep our finger on the pulse of and start to get a view as to what our role needs to be relative to it.
And a question from Lee Pascal about the global economy. I mean, if things go well here but don't go well elsewhere, I mean, how does that impact us and the efforts of the Fed to keep the economy on track?
Well, it definitely will affect us. Our economy is heavily driven by domestic consumption, but not exclusively driven by domestic consumption. So for that 30 to 35% that is connected to the to the global economy, that will grow slower, which potentially, if the rest of the world does not recover quite as well. And this is one of the reasons why when you hear public health officials talk, they talk about this, like the virus needs to be tackled everywhere, right? If you have pockets where it's not tackled, those places are not going to grow and recover nearly as well. And that will, hurt our global economy. And so we really need to get that in check. I will continue to monitor developments overseas and with our trading partners to keep a tabs on that and have a sense of the implications for our economic growth.
Related to that, Gail Evans asks, are you concerned about the push to bring supply chains back to the United States, higher U.S. tariffs, economic nationalism? How serious is that? Is that a big issue that you take into account?
So it's an issue, in the sense that it affects the cost of doing business and the cost of goods and transactions. Economic theory is pretty clear that global trade is a more efficient outcome, but there are also considerations. I think about resilience and and redundancy in ability to produce, and national security issues that are also quite important. As we learned through this crisis, there are a number of goods that turned out to be essential that we didn't have as much control in the production of as we might have wanted to. I think about some of the PPE types of goods. So I think some of this is a thought of that. And another, as I've talked to businesses that do a lot of overseas production, they're trying to diversify that base as well. So as opposed to having all of your plants in Vietnam or in China, they're now trying to spread it out so that they are less impacted. And some of that spread out could be back here in the United States. So it's interesting, but it actually cuts both ways, because the increased resilience, while it may reduce the point estimate of efficiency, it will reduce the range of possible outcomes when there are disruptions.
Hey, we've got a whole bunch of questions. Actually, I'm going to send them to you by email. We'll turn them into Word document, so that you and your staff can reach out to people. But is there anything showing up in the I love this, in the Beige Book that we should be aware of? I mean, what sort of anecdotal information are you getting that indicate that things are heading off in a certain way that we, the public, don't know about, aren't paying attention to?
Well, hopefully you've read the Beige Book, and so there's nothing that you don't know. But what I would say is this: I actually think that there are many pockets of the economy where we're starting to see a recovery that is looking like a pre-COVID level. And I talked to a lot of businesses say demand is up, we're doing well. Two things I would say on this: employers have been reluctant to hire back to the full levels that they saw pre-COVID, even as demand has come back because of uncertainty about what the future is going to hold. And I think that caution is really born out of the idea that they don't want to have to bring people on and then let them go again. Like, that's very unpleasant, and that's important. Then the second thing is the unevenness that I mentioned with Dennis, in the sense that even as the aggregate numbers come back strong, there are still many places in the country that are, if they've seen any recovery, it's just the beginning hints of it. And I think we are going to have to remain diligent and make sure that we understand that, particularly in this COVID thing, where the impacts have been so uneven, that the aggregate is not going to be telling the whole story, and that there's going to be a lot of people at the other side. I talk about the less than economy, like the less than sign. There's a lot that's going up, but there's also a good amount that's going down. And we're going to need to, and that dynamic still exists today, and it's something we're going to have to be mindful of as policymakers.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Raphael Bostic and Dennis Lockhart. I mean, I appreciate Dennis moderating and asking way better questions than I ever would have asked. I like the idea of that having a job description that includes be wary. I think that's terrific, and I'm glad to know that that's in your job description. We're going to send the audience members contacts for the Atlanta Fed, how to sign up for their various publications, including the Beige Book. We've got some upcoming programs I want to tell you all about, kind of advertise a little bit here. On Thursday, April 1, that is 2 days from today at 1:30, we have Hartsfield Jackson General Manager John Selden on his next to last day in office before he departs for his new job as CEO of the airport at Neom, a $500 billion resort and business center under construction on Saudi Arabia's Red Sea coast. We just confirmed this yesterday, and registration should have opened while we were talking just now. Next week, we have John Hope Bryant on Wednesday on building the Black middle class. And then on Thursday, Ambassador Thomas Shannon talking about under what conditions the U.S. should rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. 3 requests I have for audience members: join the World Affairs Council as an individual or corporate member. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You have to subscribe, but it's free of charge. And if you do, you'll be able to see this program this afternoon and our other previous programs. And please invite your friends to join one of our programs. I want to give my thanks to Kimberly Tyson and the staff of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, who helped us set this up. Thanks to Valerin Lopez DeFrank, our producer, and to Fernando Lucchini Ishihara, the council's executive director. And once again, thank you so much, Raphael Bostic and Dennis Lockhart. This has been a tremendous 50 minutes we have spent with you. And I guarantee you, I'm going to be going over the YouTube video and taking notes again. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. You guys are terrific.
Absolute pleasure.
Great. Thanks.